Here we are in the Piazza del Popolo, the northern entrance to the city of Rome, the threshold to the city of Rome. In this part of the course, we're going to be talking about the city as theater. In the previous sections, we've talked about the city as reliquary and the city in memory. And it's not as if we haven't encountered the city as theater in the early portions of the course. For example, in the Piazza of St. Peter's, we encountered the idea of the piazza as an amphitheater, which really means a double theater. Here at the Piazza del Popolo, we're going to talk about the ways in which the city functioned as a theater. As Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage. And what he was doing was really repeating a fairly common trope of his time. So the time of the late Renaissance and early Baroque, in which there was a relationship between, if you like, macrocosm and microcosm, the world at large, the city and the person, and all of those things were seen as, in some way or another, analogous, related, and versions of each other. So there's a way in which the city is like a theater. Theaters were like cities at the same time. And all of these were a kind of microcosm of the world, which is why Shakespeare called his theater in London the Globe. Before we talk about this specific space that we're in, though, we need to talk about the ways in which the city looked like a theater and the ways in which it was formed like a theater in the urbanistic and architectural sense. Later in this section of the course, we're going to talk about the ways in which the city functioned as a theater, with the Piazza route and the processions that moved through the city in a theatrical way, animating and activating the stage of the city. But first we need to talk about how it takes the form of a theater. One of the primary affinities between architectural space in reality and illusionistically was the development of illusionistic perspective in the early part of the 15th century by Brunelleschi in Florence. Brunelleschi's notion of perspective allowed him to project onto a two-dimensional surface the three-dimensional world. And in so doing, he developed a way in which he could create the illusion of three-dimensional reality on that two-dimensional surface. But at the same time, artists and architects were thinking about the ways in which the world itself could be organized in that same rational way. And so they were very much enamored of things like long straight streets that went to a terminal destination, some sort of focus, like the obelisks we've seen, or the buildings at the end of streets. So that perspectival orientation of space, organization of space, to a destination that's clear, rational, and ordered was one way in which the city began to be organized like a theater. Now, that way of organizing the city as a theater also meant that you could see the theater in the city itself, and it could become a theater. Not that it simply looked like what one did on the stage, but in fact the city would function in that same way. Now, when Shakespeare said all the world's a stage, there are a number of ways in which the theater could function. Different kinds of theatrical performances could take place. And each one had its appropriate setting. For the ancient Roman writer Vitruvius, there were three different kinds of stages, classical stages that he proposed. One was the tragic stage with classical architecture, fully organized and ordered and beautiful and perfect. There was the comic stage, which is a bit of a jumble of ordinary life and a kind of mix of architectural styles. And the third was the satiric stage, which was really the world of nature, the world outside the city walls. When the Renaissance treatise writer Sebastiano Serlio illustrated his treatise on the classical language of architecture and urban space, Serlio described these three different kinds of stages and illustrated them at the same time. And the thing he said that's interesting about each of them is that, well, what makes a tragedy is tragedies are what happen to gods and heroes, to the great and the good. So tragedy is noble, but it's also tragic in the sense that often awful things happen to them. But being tragic and being noble, it demands a noble architectural setting. The comic, instead, for Serlio, is what happens to ordinary people, people like us. And those ordinary people live in an ordinary world that's a bit of a jumble, a bit disordered, not subject to the same laws of absolute formal order, perspectival orientation, and perspectival space. So that idea of perspective, the street as a kind of a corridor, going to a specific destination is fundamental to the ways in which people organize stage sets, and then the ways in which cities began to be organized like stage sets. There was also the idea that the piazza itself could be a kind of a theater. And in the 17th century, Pope Alexander VII described lots of his architectural projects as a teatro. He called Santa Maria della Pace the Teatro di Santa Maria della Pace. And when we see Santa Maria della Pace, we'll see how in many specific ways, it really is structured like a stage set. Here in the Piazza del Popolo, in order for the stage to work, the illusion to work, people entering from the Porta del Popolo to the north pass through into a space that's somewhat different than the space we're in today. The space we're in today was enlarged laterally, east and west, in the beginning of the 19th century. What it lost was that sense of containment. When you entered into the Porta del Popolo previously, you entered into a funnel-shaped space that widened towards these three streets. The one down the middle is the most ancient of all of them. It's a Roman street that brought people in from the north. It was the extension of the Via Flaminia, one of the major Roman roads. And as the saying goes, all roads lead to Rome. And so one of those roads leading to Rome was the Via Flaminia. In the early years of the Roman Empire, the Via Flaminia didn't actually enter the city until farther down the road. But later in the empire, when the Aurelianic walls were built, this became the threshold to the city. And farther down the road, that street took the name Via Lata. In the Renaissance, it took the name Via del Corso because they often ran corsi, or races, down the street, especially at carnival time. So that's another kind of performance that happened in the city. The other streets happened a little bit by accident and a little bit by design. The street to the right, the Via di Ripetta, named after the Porta di Ripetta, which was on the Tiber River, was originally called the Via Leonina because it was built by Pope Leo X, essentially rebuilding an ancient Roman street that had fallen into disuse. That street took you to the right, closer to the Tiber River, hugged the Tiber, and was the most direct way to get to St. Peter's from here. The street to the left was begun by his nephew, who became Pope, as Clement VII. And that street, the Via Clemencia, went a little far down its current route, but was extended under a later Pope, Paul III, down towards the area past, in fact, where the Spanish Steps are now. Eventually, Pope Sixtus V would connect that street with the upper part of the hill where the Spanish Steps currently are, and that would take you all the way onto the Lateran. So here we are at a threshold, which really is very much presenting the city to you as a series of options. And you, as actor, can choose to walk down which one of these routes you prefer. Now, if you're a ceremonial guest in the city of Rome, like the Queen Christina of Sweden, who abdicated her throne and converted to Catholicism in the 1650s, she entered Rome through the Porta del Popolo, and for that, they redecorated the interior of the Porta del Popolo under the project of Gian Lorenzo Bernini. For Queen Christina, her entry into Rome was a procession, was an event, a theatrical event. For many pilgrims entering into Rome, they may have straggled into Rome, exhausted from their journey, and would have just been thrilled to have arrived in the city walls and find a place to sleep for the night. Queen Christina, like many visitors to Rome, was taken on a procession through the city. She was taken around to be shown the highlights before ultimately taken to her destination, which is St. Peter's. So there were both the great and the good. In many ways, this functioned as a tragic stage, and it also functioned as a comic stage. Now, those three streets, essentially symmetrical. The one in the middle, the ancient Roman street, long and straight, essentially north-south, taking you all the way to the Capitoline Hill. That one existed. The other two happened by symmetry. The first one on the right, the Via Leonina, over a Roman road that had fallen into disuse. The one on the left, essentially by symmetry. And what it created is something called the Trident, or a trivium of streets, a three-pronged fork, if you like. That became a dominant way of organizing architectural space in the 17th and 18th century throughout Europe, especially European cities, but also, for example, in the gardens of Versailles. So this way of organizing somewhat irregular space, in the sense that the city wasn't organized like a grid here. Here it's radial. It opens up like a panorama of possibilities for us. And each one of these possibilities will conduct us to a different part of the city. Again, ceremonial visitors would have been taken on a tour. If you're a pilgrim, you're probably just desperate to find some place to sleep. And everyone would have found their way to where they need to go down one of those streets. But in order to formalize that experience and turn that threshold experience, a little bit like we talked about at the threshold of the Borgo Vaticano, where you're presented again there with three streets that diverge but would ultimately take you to St. Peter's. Here you had choices to make, and you were at a kind of second threshold moment. The first threshold being the Porta del Popolo, the second one being here this option before you proceed into the city fabric itself. But as we suggested, obelisks both terminate vistas, as they do for these streets, but they also mark beginnings, as they do here, the beginning of your journey into the city of Rome. In the 1660s, Pope Alexander VII commissioned these projects for churches to crown these two prows of land in between the three streets in order to mark a kind of ceremonial threshold into the city with some degree of formal order. Now again, it's an approximate formal order because as you've been looking at these churches, I'm sure you've been assuming that they're symmetrical, but in fact they're not symmetrical. They're in slightly different shapes of land, and so the one on the left is oval, and the one on the right is absolutely central, circular, with an octagonal dome. They're both dedicated to Mary, and in fact many of the options of entering into the city of Rome have Marian connotations. So if you took the street off to the left, the Via Clemencia, that eventually became the Via Paola, and now has taken the name Via del Babuino, the Street of the Baboon, simply because there was a representation of a baboon down the street at one point. That street would take you to the Trinità dei Monti at the top of the Spanish Steps, but ultimately to Santa Maria Maggiore, and then from there to the other great pilgrimage churches. The one in the middle takes you to the Araceli, Santa Maria in Araceli, which crowns the Capitoline Hill, and which we've seen as a place of both reliquary and destination, and the kind of sacred alternative to the political center of the Campidoglio. And then the last one to the right isn't so much Marian in orientation as oriented towards essentially the heart of the Abitato, the inhabited part of Rome, the Campus Martius, and from there to St. Peter's itself. So as we experience our entry into the city of Rome here, we want to think about choices that we're going to make. Where are we going from here? What do we want to see? And where are we trying to get to in the end? But ultimately, if you're a tourist of Rome, you want to see it all. So it really is an open palimpsest. We can choose anything we like, and everywhere we go, we'll find something of interest. After this section of the course, we're going to be processing along what's called the Pozzesso route, where the Pope took possession of the city of Rome. And he moved through Rome through a very specific path from one side of the city to the other, and experienced a very specific relationship of St. Peter's to the Lateran and a specific slice, if you like, through the heart of ancient Rome.